that you need to know. Okay? We're going to move to the next part of that. So when Southerners find out about this Underground Railroad, they suddenly want a much stricter fugitive slave law. To them, the law is not strict enough. We had a law that actually dated back to the 1790s. They didn't think it was strict enough. If they are going to, the Southerners say, if they're going to take our slaves, if they're going to hide them, if they're going to help them to escape, then we want a stricter law that allows us to then go up and take them back and bring them back. All right? Let's go to 21, the Compromise of 1850. Who led it getting passed? Henry Clay did. Now, hey, Stephen Douglas technically is the man who's going to get it passed because Clay dies before it's finished. But ultimately, it's Clay on his deathbed who encourages the nation to compromise one last time, and that's what's going to happen. All righty. Who opposed it? Generally, Southerners did. Extremists on both sides did, both abolitionists and Southerners, but generally speaking, most of the country supported it. All right. What did the compromise do? Well, the memory device there is pop fact. All right, if you remember, California is admitted as a free state. The rest of the Mexican Cession is going to be opened up to popular sovereignty. We'll let the people in those territories decide. California getting free state. The fugitive slave law is strengthened. It is passed. We have a stricter, stronger fugitive slave law. That's something that Southerners wanted. Remember, the slave trade is banned in Washington, D.C. That's something that abolitionists wanted. They thought it was an embarrassment that foreigners could see slaves being bought and sold across from the White House. Alrighty, finally, the least significance, if you remember, Texas gives up some of its claims to New Mexico to keep the peace, so that we did not have states that went to war against one another. Ultimately, that is the compromise, and it's going to temporarily be a bandage. I keep the peace like a Band-Aid. It's going to preserve temporarily the balance that existed between North and South. Let's move on to the election of 1852 and its significance. Well, the election of 1852 is where Franklin Pierce, the Democrat, is going to win. All right, what's the significance of this election? It's not really that Pierce wins so much as that the Whigs, remember, are fractured and fall apart. They're hopelessly divided by the slavery issue. They have no national policy. The members of the Whigs decide, you know what, we can't agree, so we're going to agree to disagree. We're going to move on, and we are going to kind of go our separate ways. Alrighty, now the Whigs fall apart. If that had not occurred, let's remember, the Republicans would not have formed. And it's possible that Abe Lincoln might never have been president of the United States. Alrighty. Let's get to Uncle Tom's Cabin and the impending crisis of the South. That is number 23. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a very famous book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in the 1850s that really changed the hearts and minds of many Northerners. They began to embrace, they began to become more sympathetic to abolitionism. She changed the minds of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people. It was the #1 bestseller of its time. It also had a profound effect on many foreign leaders who read it and who were horrified by some of the accounts that she depicted. Southerners despised it. They claimed she lied, that she exaggerated. Despite that fact, it was very powerful. It influenced Lincoln, it influenced the Queen of England, it had influenced many, many Americans in the North. There was a second book. It was called The Impending Crisis of the South. It was written in nonfiction by a guy named Hinton Helper. It sounds like Hamburger Helper. This was an attempt to convince Southerners to poor Southern whites to give up slavery once and for all. Most of these Southerners ignored it, didn't read the book. Those that did disagreed completely. There were dozens of responses to this book written by Southerners where they defended slavery. All right, hey, it's a nonfiction book. It's the most famous of its time. It's not very significant. Uncle Tom's Cabin is the book that really was massively important. Okay, we're going to go to number 24 here, U.S. expansion under Pierce. Look, Southerners under President Pierce, remember Pierce is a Northerner, but he supported slavery. Begin to look overseas to try to find new places for American states. All right, the first place they're going to look is Cuba. We'd wanted Cuba for a long time. Remember, under Franklin Pierce, Southerners tried to pass the Ostend Manifesto, where we would offer millions of dollars to Spain. If they refused, we would invade Cuba ourselves. Northerners blocked it, alrighty, but the fact that the Ostend Manifesto was even attempted demonstrates that Southerners are now looking elsewhere, overseas, to foreign countries, to try to keep the balance between slave and free state. All right. Also, we have Nicaragua. Over in Nicaragua, of course, we have a guy named Walker, James Walker. He leads a private army to that country. He overthrows it. He plans on, he hopes he'll be annexed by the United States so that he can become a new southern state down there in the middle of Central America. That never happens. He is overthrown, and ultimately the old government is put back in charge in Nicaragua. All right. We also expanded economically during this time under Pierce into China and Japan. Remember, Japan, we did so by sending our Great Black Fleet over there and kind of forcing them to open up to American trade. Lastly, the last piece of territory acquired that completes our continental 48 United States is the Gadsden Purchase. That was purchased as well during this period. It was purchased, if you remember, to try to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. We believed the southern route originally was going to be the best route to build, and so we needed this strip of land to complete the railroad building. Ultimately, even though we bought the land, the railroad wasn't completed until much, much later after the war. Okay? Let's go to 25. What was Kansas, Nebraska? Kansas, Nebraska was an attempt by Stephen Douglas, the new Speaker of the House, to try to build a northern transcontinental railroad first, all right? He believed that the transcontinental railroad ought to flow through the north and not the south. He believed it ought to flow through his state, Illinois, and so of course what does he do? He repeals compromise, the Missouri Compromise, and he converts those unorganized territories into the Kansas-Nebraska territories. He opens them up to popular sovereignty. Of course, Southerners love this because now they have the opportunity to turn Kansas into a slave state when previously they never would have had that option. Of course, Northern abolitionists are horrified. Many Northerners, feel like Douglas betrays them. This fellow Northerner has betrayed them. Ultimately, we know it's going to lead to Bleeding Kansas. And that starts almost immediately because now Kansas is open to popular sovereignty. Both sides are going to rush extremists in to try to win the election or try to influence or intimidate others. Ultimately, what happens there is that we have almost a mini civil war. Both sides are going to commit attacks. The attacks from the Southerners are so bad that eventually most Northerners boycott the election. And ultimately, it's the pro-slavery folks in Kansas that are going to win the election. All right. On top of that, of course, we've got Potawatomi Massacre. That's where John Brown, remember, angry over Bleeding Kansas. He's angry over the Brooks-Sumner affair, where Preston Brooks caned Charles Sumner in Congress. And so he takes his vengeance out on these 5 pro-slavery guys along the border of Kansas and Missouri. Remember, they hack them to death with broadswords. All righty. Finally, number 26, what was the Lecompton Constitution? That was the pro-slavery constitution that was passed by those slavery folks in Kansas after they won the election. It was rejected by Congress. Congress sent it back to them, said you need to rewrite it. Before they could rewrite it, the war broke out. All right, so Kansas never officially became a slave state. Number 27, the election of 1856. That's Buchanan and Fremont. James Buchanan, the Democrat's going to win. John Fremont is your first Republican candidate. Remember, the Southerners vowed if you vote for Fremont, we will secede, even though, of course, if you remember, Fremont, like Lincoln, wasn't going to abolish slavery, just didn't want it to expand into new places. Okay? Dred Scott decision and its impact. Dred Scott, the case itself, we know the decision. Remember, he said that court rules, the pro-Southern court rules, hey, Dred Scott, you're a slave. Even if your master takes you into free territory, you're still a slave. Nothing changes until you get your freedom papers. Ultimately, what the court rules here is that the whole idea of popular sovereignty is null and void, that it doesn't apply. Because if a slave owner can take his slave anytime he wants to, anywhere he wants to, then the whole thing of free versus slave state doesn't even apply. Alrighty, it doesn't matter, it doesn't make any sense. Alright, so the court kind of basically says, hey, all of this argument over popular sovereignty is pointless, because at the end of the day, according to our decision, slave owners can take their slaves anywhere they want to anyways. Okay? Its impact, it obviously divides the Democratic Party between Northerners and Southerners. And of course, it's going to lead to Stephen Douglas making some major mistakes when he talks about this decision. Alrighty, let's get to number 29, the Panic of 1857 and the effect it had on secession. Well, the Panic of 1857 was a panic that, well, we know it largely affected the North. All right, it affected the North disproportionately, more so than the South. It hit industry hard. There was a lot of unemployment, especially in factory jobs. And so what it does is give Southerners a false sense of security. It caused Southerners to believe maybe we don't need the North, maybe we don't need to rely on them any longer, maybe we're the ones that are actually stronger, maybe King Cotton is more stable, and so many secessionists used the panic to convince other Southerners that they ought to go ahead and support secession, that they ought to support breaking away from the nation. Okay? 30, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Two major effects of these debates. One, Abraham Lincoln becomes a household name. He becomes a national name because he performs so well in these debates against Stephen Douglas, who everybody already knew since he was the Speaker of the House. Secondly, remember at one of these debates, the Freeport debate, Lincoln gets Douglas to make a catastrophic mistake. Remember, Douglas announces or admits he would still support popular sovereignty even after Dred Scott. He would simply ignore the court's decision. When Southerners hear this omission by Douglas, that dooms his chances of ever being president, because now this man who made it possible for Kansas to become slave is basically saying, I would still allow Kansas to potentially come free if enough people voted for it. And so Southerners feel like he has turned his back on them. Northerners already weren't really going to vote. Most Northerners weren't going to vote for Douglas because of what he had done with the Kansas-Nebraska. Now Southerners turned their backs on him as well following the Lincoln-Douglas debate. Folks, that takes us to the election of 1860. And we know what happens here. Lincoln's going to win because basically the other candidates divide the vote. There are two Democrats. They split the Democratic vote. There's two Southern candidates. They both split the Southern vote. That means Lincoln has enough to win the election. He's not even on the ballot in most Southern states. He wins all of his votes from the North, all of his electoral votes. He wins with the lowest popular majority in American history, 40%. But ultimately, he has the electoral majority, and that's all you need to be president. All right? Immediately when Lincoln wins the presidency, South Carolina and those deep South states follow through on their threat, follow through on their promise. They go ahead, they secede from the United States. All right, now number 31, what was the Crittenden Amendment? Also known as the Crittenden Compromise. It was a last-ditch attempt by a congressman named Crittenden to try to piece together a Henry Clay-like compromise that would maintain the peace. It was rejected by Congress. Even if it had been passed, it would have been vetoed by Lincoln. At this point, both sides have decided once and for all, enough is enough. We are going to war. The only way to settle this is war. All righty? Of course, make sure you know John Brown and Harper's Ferry as well. I don't think I put it on the review, but just make sure you're familiar with it as well. 32, where were the first shots of the Civil War fired? The first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter. Alrighty, eventually Fort Sumter surrenders. When Fort Sumter surrenders, Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion now that the Southerners have fired the first shot. Okay. Where was the first major battle? The first major battle was at a place called Bull Run in Virginia. It was and most people expected when the war broke out that there would be one big battle that would decide the outcome, that it would be over in a couple of months. And so what happened here early on in 1861 is both armies basically met in between the two capitals. They had this battle, the Battle of Bull Run, and it was incredibly deadly. It was incredibly bloody. Basically both sides realized afterwards, hey, this is going to be a much, much longer war. This is going to be a much, much larger conflict. In fact, immediately after that battle, Lincoln converted those volunteers from 90-day service periods to 3-year service periods. He basically said, hey, I know you signed up to only fight for 3 months, but I'm going to need you for 3 years. All righty? And they were forced to fight and serve for that long. Where did the South officially surrender? Well, the surrender took place in 1865. They surrendered just west of Richmond. After Richmond fell, the South surrendered at a place called Appomattox Courthouse. All right, a tiny little crossroads. It's almost like in the middle of the wilderness. Just so happened to be the spot where Lee was surrounded by Grant and was forced to finally surrender the remaining part of his army. Okay. Describe the Naval War that took place. Well, the Naval War really was one-sided. The North dominated. All right, the North had the Navy, the South didn't. The North established a blockade. It was called the Anaconda Plan. The South really could do nothing to stop them. What the South did try to do was, well, they tried to get ships through the blockade that could maybe get supplies in or out. They tried to convince Britain and other countries to maybe join with them so they could take advantage of those European navies. And then they tried to buy ships. They tried to purchase ships or have the British build ships for them that they could then use to defeat the blockade. Ultimately, none of these were successful. Eventually, the blockade completely strangled all Southern cotton. They couldn't get anything out. It's one of the reasons the Southerners end up losing this war. Okay. What Southern states seceded first and when? I believe I already said that. What prompted Virginia and the other Southern states to secede? We're on question 35, by the way. When Lincoln called for the volunteers, those other states, including Virginia, said, you know what, we're not gonna go to war with our fellow Southerners. And so they decided to support their fellow Southern states, and they went ahead and seceded then. All righty. Number 36, what was the Union strategy for winning the war before 1861? It was to capture Richmond. Alrighty. After they realized it was going to be a long battle, a long war, they changed their strategy and they went to a new one. The new strategy basically said, we're going to, blockade them. We're going to cut off all trade in and out. Alrighty. Then they captured the Mississippi River. All right. So they divided the Confederacy in half. Alrighty. After they captured the Mississippi River. And then, of course, Sherman is going to do his famous March to the Sea, where they're going to commit total war. They're going to destroy all Southern resources. And then eventually, after the Southerners had no other choice, then they would accept a surrender. All right, so blockade, capture the Mississippi, divide the South in half. All righty. Total war, we're scorched earth. We're going to destroy all resources that can be used by the South to crush their will to resist, so they stop resisting. And then finally, accept nothing less than absolute surrender. Okay? What were the Union advantages and disadvantages? The biggest Union advantages, of course, were population. They outnumbered the South 22 million to 5. Industry, resources, technology. The North could constantly replenish their materials. The South could not. It's only a matter of time. The longer the war goes on, the better for the North, unless the South can somehow get Europeans in to assist them, to ally with them. Alrighty. What are the Confederate advantages? Oh, the biggest disadvantages for the North. They had terrible military leadership until the end of the war. Until Ulysses S. Grant, Northern generals were bad. All right, they were not strong. They were constantly overmatched by their Southern rivals, their Southern counterparts. Despite all of these advantage, technology, weapons, the Southerners kept winning these battles because their generals were so superior to the North. Eventually, when Lincoln finally finds Ulysses S. Grant out west and brings him to fight against Lee, all of this changes and the war finally ends. Okay. What were the Confederate advantages? Again, Confederates had amazing military leaders. They were great soldiers as well. They were more used to the outdoors, to hunting, to horseback, than many of the folks who lived in the industrial North were. Alrighty, so they were kind of better, more capable soldiers. Their leaders, their generals, were very skilled as well. The biggest weakness, really, for the South is, again, they don't have a large population. They're totally outnumbered, 4 or 5 to 1. They have no industry, they have no weapons, ammunition, no shoes, no uniforms. They're constantly trying to just piece together what they can to keep the war effort going, alrighty? And they don't have very strong political leaders. The North had Lincoln, this great cabinet of Lincolns. South does not, alrighty? They're really limited by Jefferson Davis and his weak political leadership, alrighty? 39, the Trent Affair. Commerce raiders, the Laird Rams, how did they threaten British neutrality during the war? Look, Britain remains neutral throughout this conflict, but a few times they nearly joined with the South. When the United States Navy seized the British ship, the Trent, Britain nearly declared war on the United States. Only thanks to the efforts of William Seward and the American diplomat Charles Francis Adams were the British convinced to not declare war. Later on in the conflict, Britain began to build ships called Laird Rams. They were like battering rams. They would have, possibly broken the Union Navy's blockade of the southern coastline. And so, when the North found out that the British were building these, They put so much pressure and so many threats against the British that eventually the British just kept the ships for themselves, did not turn them over to the South. Alrighty. Lastly, look, the British were sympathetic to the South, or at least the government was, until the